He thought he was throwing out a nobody, but Daniel Carter had no idea he was about to erase his own place in the very building he controlled. The morning light poured through the wide garage doors, casting long reflections across polished concrete as engines hummed and tools clinked in steady rhythm. A place built on grease, skill, and quiet respect until Daniel changed the air the moment he walked in. His white tailored suit cutting through the grit like he didn't belong to it, but owned it. His voice sharp, his presence louder than the machines. Mechanics straightened when he passed, not out of respect but obligation. And then the door creaked open again, slower this time, and Robert Hayes stepped inside, boots worn, hands stained from years of work, his denim jacket faded at the seams. The kind of man most people stopped noticing before they even looked twice. He didn't announce himself, didn't demand attention. He simply walked in and observed, eyes calm, steady, taking in every corner like he'd seen it all before. But Daniel noticed him immediately, his lips curling slightly as he sized him up from head to toe. The silence around Robert felt heavier than it should have, but Daniel broke it with a low chuckle that spread quickly through the room. "We got a visitor," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The rhythm of the garage slowing as heads turned, a few smirks forming. Robert didn't respond, just set his worn tool bag gently onto a steel table, the sound soft but deliberate. Daniel stepped closer, the scent of cologne clashing with oil and metal. "You lost, old man?" he asked, voice dripping with mock politeness. A few mechanics exchanged glances, unsure but unwilling to interfere. Robert met his eyes for a brief moment, not challenging, not apologizing, just steady, and somehow that silence irritated Daniel more than any response could have. "This isn't some roadside shop," Daniel continued, louder now. "You don't just walk in here and pretend you belong." A ripple of laughter followed, thin and uneasy, but Robert didn't move, didn't defend himself, didn't explain. He simply stood there, as if waiting, and in that moment, something unspoken shifted, though no one could quite name it yet. And Daniel, convinced he held all the power, took one step closer, unknowingly stepping into a story that was never going to end the way he expected. Daniel Carter did not step back, not yet, because men like him rarely recognized the moment they crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal. "Let me make this simple for you," he said, adjusting the cuff of his white sleeve as if the conversation itself inconvenienced him. "This garage runs on standards, and you clearly do not meet them." A few nearby mechanics pretended to stay busy, but their ears tilted toward every word, the tension stretching thin across the concrete floor. Robert Hayes remained still, his posture relaxed but grounded, as if he had stood in this exact spot 1,000 times before. Daniel mistook that calm for weakness, and that was his first real mistake. "You hear me?" Daniel pressed, louder now, his voice echoing off steel tool cabinets and lifted trucks. "We do not need extra hands, especially not ones that look like they belong in a junkyard down the road." A couple of younger workers let out nervous laughs, not because it was funny, but because silence felt dangerous. Robert slowly glanced around the garage, his eyes tracing the hydraulic lifts, the alignment machines, the diagnostic screens, each detail absorbing into him like memory instead of observation. One older mechanic near the back hesitated, recognition flickering across his face, but he said nothing. "Not yet." Daniel noticed the glance and snapped his fingers sharply. "Focus," he barked, reclaiming control of the room. Then he pointed toward the open bay door where sunlight spilled across the pavement outside. "You can leave now, before I make this a bigger issue than it needs to be." The words hung heavy, final, authoritative. Robert finally moved, but not toward the exit. Instead, he took one slow step deeper into the garage, the sound of his boot against the concrete echoing louder than it should have. And something about that single step shifted the energy in the room, subtle but undeniable. Daniel frowned, confusion creeping into the edges of his confidence. "I do not think you understand," he said, his tone tightening. "I run this place." Robert's eyes lifted to meet his again, calm, steady, unreadable, and for the first time Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for doubt to slip in, unnoticed by him but felt by everyone else. The machines continued humming, yet the atmosphere had changed, as if the garage itself was holding its breath, waiting for. Something none of them could yet see coming. Daniel Carter felt that hesitation linger for just a fraction too long, and men like him were trained to crush that feeling before it could grow. So he straightened his posture, forcing a confident smile back onto his face as he took another step forward, closing the space between them as if proximity alone could re-establish control. "You think standing there makes a point?" he said, his voice sharper now, less polished than before, the edge beginning to show. "Because from where I am standing, you are still just a man who walked into the wrong place." A few workers nodded quickly, eager to align themselves with authority, but not all of them. Not anymore. That older mechanic in the back, a man named Frank, wiped his hands slowly on a rag, his eyes narrowing as he studied Robert more carefully. Something about the way Robert held himself did not match the image Daniel was trying to paint. It was not defiance, not arrogance, but something quieter, something that did not need approval. Daniel noticed the shift in attention and snapped his head toward Frank. "You got something to say?" he demanded, the room tightening again. But Frank shook his head, stepping back, choosing silence over confrontation, and that silence echoed louder than any words could have. Robert finally moved his hand, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to reach into his jacket pocket. And for a moment the entire garage seemed to lean into that single motion. Tools paused mid-air, conversations died. Before they began, Daniel let out a short laugh, trying to break the tension. "What is that? You going to show me a resume?" he mocked. A few weak chuckles followed, but they faded almost immediately as Robert pulled out a simple, worn phone. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed importance. And yet the way he held it carried a weight that no one could explain. He looked at the screen briefly, then lifted his gaze back to Daniel, calm as ever. "You said you run this place," Robert said quietly, his voice steady, almost reflective, and that alone was enough to unsettle the air again. Because it was not a challenge, it was a statement. Daniel scoffed, crossing his arms. "I do," he replied without hesitation, doubling down on the claim. But somewhere beneath that certainty, something fragile began to crack. Robert nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something already decided, and then, without raising his voice, without seeking permission, he pressed a single button on his phone, and in that moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The garage stood suspended in a silence that felt heavier than before, as if the building itself was waiting to reveal whose name truly belonged to it. For one brief second, nothing happened, and Daniel Carter let out a breath that almost sounded like victory, a smirk returning to his face as he shook his head slightly. "That is it," he said, his voice regaining its earlier arrogance. "You press a button and expect something to change." A few workers relaxed, tension slipping just enough for quiet murmurs to return, the hum of machines filling the space again as if the moment had passed. But Robert Hayes did not move. He did not explain. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. And then it happened, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. One of the diagnostic screens flickered, a faint blink that caught the attention of a technician standing nearby. He frowned, tapping the side of the monitor. But before he could say anything, another screen went dark. Then another. The sound of a hydraulic lift paused mid-motion. Its steady mechanical were cutting off into silence. A wrench slipped from someone's hand and clattered against the concrete floor, louder than it should have been. And just like that, the entire garage began to shift. Engines idling shut down one by one, the rhythm that once filled the space collapsing into something unfamiliar, something controlled. Daniel's smile faltered, his eyes darting across the room as confusion replaced certainty. "What is going on?" he demanded, his voice rising. But no one answered because no one knew. The systems that kept the garage alive were no longer responding. And for the first time since he walked in, Daniel looked like a man who did not understand his own environment. A young technician rushed toward a control panel, pressing buttons, checking connections, but everything remained unresponsive, locked, overridden, as if the building itself had decided to listen to someone else. Robert finally took a slow step forward, his boots echoing through the growing silence, each movement deliberate, unhurried, and every eye followed him now, not with mockery, but with something else, something closer to realization. Daniel turned back toward him, his voice no longer steady. "What did you do?" he asked, and this time, it was not a command. It was a question, Robert met his gaze, calm as ever, and said nothing, because he did not need to. The answer was already unfolding around them. The garage stood still, every machine quiet, every worker frozen in place. And in that silence, the truth began to surface, not through words, but through control, through presence, through the undeniable shift of power that no one could ignore anymore. And for the first time that morning, Daniel Carter was no longer the one in charge. The silence did not break. It deepened, pressing against every corner of the garage until even the smallest movement felt too loud. Daniel Carter stood frozen for a moment longer, his mind racing to find an explanation that would restore his control, but none came, because control was no longer his to claim. A supervisor from the back office hurried forward, his tablet in hand, his face pale as he glanced between the darkened systems and Robert Hayes. "Sir," he said carefully, his voice low but unmistakably respectful. "The network override just triggered from the primary account." A murmur rippled through the room, subtle but undeniable, the kind that spreads when people begin to understand something before it is fully said. Daniel turned sharply. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, grasping for authority that was already slipping through his fingers. The supervisor hesitated, then looked directly at Robert again. "The primary account," he repeated, slower this time. "Only the owner has that level of access." The words landed heavier than anything Daniel had said all morning. The air shifted completely, the laughter from earlier now distant, almost unreal. A few mechanics straightened, others stepped back slightly, as if the space itself had rearranged around a truth they could no longer ignore. Daniel shook his head, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to himself. "That is not possible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I manage this entire place." Robert finally moved again, not to assert dominance, not to intimidate, but simply to step into the center of the space that had always been his. His presence now undeniable, no longer invisible. His voice when it came was calm, steady, and impossible to dismiss. "Managing is not the same as owning," he said, and the room went completely still. Daniel's expression faltered, the confidence that once defined him replaced by something uncertain, something smaller. He looked around as if searching for support, but no one met his eyes anymore. The same people who had laughed now avoided his gaze, because they understood what he did not want to accept. Robert reached down and picked up his worn tool bag, placing it gently on the workbench as if reclaiming something that had never truly left him. "This place," he continued quietly, "was built long before you walked in wearing that suit." Each word carried weight, not through volume, but through truth, the kind that did not need to be proven twice. The supervisor stepped aside instinctively, creating space without being asked, and in that moment, the hierarchy of the entire garage shifted, not through force, but through recognition. Daniel stood there, no longer the center, no longer the voice that controlled the room, and for the first time, he realized that the man he tried to throw out was the one person he should have respected from the very beginning. Daniel Carter opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out, because there was nothing left that could restore what had already been lost. The authority he wore so confidently just minutes ago now felt like a costume that no longer fit. The white suit that once demanded attention now only highlighted how out of place he truly was. Robert Hayes did not raise his voice, did not issue commands, and that was what unsettled the room the most, because real control did not need volume. It did not need performance. It simply existed. The supervisor stood beside him quietly, waiting, not for instructions, but for acknowledgement, and Robert gave a small nod, barely noticeable, yet it was enough. The systems flickered back to life one by one, screens glowing, lifts resuming their motion, engines restarting, but the rhythm of the garage had changed. It no longer revolved around Daniel. It followed something steadier, something grounded. Daniel glanced around, searching for the familiar reactions he once controlled, but the workers had shifted, their posture different now, their attention no longer directed toward him. A few of them exchanged looks, not mocking, not fearful, but understanding, the kind that comes when truth replaces assumption. Daniel cleared his throat, attempting to recover. "If there has been some misunderstanding," he began, his voice strained, carefully choosing each word as if they might rebuild his position. But Robert turned his gaze toward him before he could finish, not harsh, not angry, just firm, and that was enough to stop him. The interruption was not loud, yet it carried more weight than anything Daniel had said all morning. "There is no misunderstanding," Robert said calmly, his tone even, the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. Daniel swallowed, his confidence slipping further, because this was no longer a conversation he could control. It was a reality he had to face. Robert looked around the garage slowly, his eyes moving from one worker to another, acknowledging them in a way that felt natural, familiar, as if he had known each of them long before this moment. And perhaps he had. "This place runs because of the people in it," he continued, his voice steady. "Not because of titles or appearances." The words settled into the room, quiet but undeniable. A mechanic near the front nodded slightly. Another straightened his posture, the shift spreading without being forced. Daniel stood there, no longer speaking, no longer leading, just present in a moment that had moved past him, and for the first time, he understood that respect was not something you could demand. It was something you either built or lost. And in that garage, surrounded by steel and silence, he realized exactly which one he had done. The garage did not return to what it was before, because moments like that do not fade. They settle, they redefine everything that comes after. Daniel Carter stood slightly off-center now, no longer the figure people instinctively turned toward, his presence still visible, but no longer commanding. And that quiet shift said more than any confrontation ever could. Robert Hayes moved through the space slowly, not to inspect, not to assert, but to reconnect, his eyes pausing on details that others overlooked: a loose cable near a workstation, a misaligned tool rack, the subtle signs of a place that had been managed, but not truly understood. Frank stepped forward this time, no longer holding back, his voice respectful, measured. "It has been a while, Robert," he said, and the familiarity in his tone confirmed what many were only beginning to realize. Robert gave a small nod, the kind that carried history without needing explanation. "Too long," he replied, and for a moment, the noise of the garage softened again, not from tension, but from recognition. Daniel watched the exchange closely, his expression tightening as pieces began to connect in ways he could no longer ignore. The workers who once followed his direction now stood with a different awareness, their respect no longer assigned by position, but earned through something deeper. Robert reached for a wrench on the bench, turning it in his hand briefly before setting it back down. A simple motion, yet it felt symbolic, as if he was reminding the room of what this place was built on: skill, consistency, quiet dedication. "Things change," Robert said calmly, not directed at anyone in particular, yet everyone listened. "But the foundation does not." His words settled into the space like a steady anchor. Daniel took a step forward, hesitation clear in the way he moved. "I was not informed," he began, his tone carefully controlled, trying to reclaim some ground. But even he seemed to realize how weak that sounded. Robert turned slightly toward him, not dismissive, not confrontational, just present. "You were informed," he said simply. And that was all. No accusation, no raised voice, just a truth that carried enough weight on its own. Daniel fell silent again, because deep down, he knew that was true. The signs had been there, the names, the documents, the system permissions he never questioned because he assumed control instead of understanding it. And now, standing in the middle of a garage that no longer answered to him, he faced the consequence of that assumption, not through punishment, but through something far more lasting: the quiet, undeniable loss of respect. And as the tools resumed their rhythm and the engines came back to life, the balance of the entire place had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The rhythm of the garage returned, but it no longer sounded the same. It carried a different weight now, one shaped by awareness rather than routine. Tools clinked, engines hummed, but beneath it all was a quiet understanding that could not be undone. Daniel Carter stood near the center for a moment longer before slowly stepping aside, not because he was told to, but because he no longer belonged at the center, and everyone felt it. No one said it out loud, yet the space adjusted around him as naturally as it had once adjusted to him. Robert Hayes moved with calm purpose, stopping beside a lifted truck, his eyes scanning the engine with a familiarity that no title could replace. He reached in and adjusted a loose connection with steady hands, the kind of motion that came from decades of doing the work, not just overseeing it. A younger mechanic nearby watched closely, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by quiet respect. That line would have slipped within a few hours, Robert said evenly, not looking up, just stating what he saw. The mechanic nodded quickly, absorbing the lesson without question, because it was not correction, it was guidance. Daniel noticed that moment, the shift in how people listened, and it settled heavily on him, heavier than the silence earlier, because this was not about systems shutting down. This was about something he could not control at all, respect being given freely to someone else. He took a careful step forward, his voice lower now, measured. "I built efficiency here," he said, almost defensively, as if trying to justify his place. Robert straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth before turning to face him, his expression calm, not dismissive, but grounded in something Daniel had not yet learned. "You built structure," Robert replied, his tone even. "But structure without understanding does not last." The words were not harsh, but they carried a quiet finality that settled deeper than any accusation. Daniel held his gaze for a moment, then looked away first, and that single break in eye contact said more than anything else could have. Around them, the garage continued, but now it followed a different center, one built on experience, presence, and quiet authority. Robert placed the cloth down carefully, his attention returning to the work around him, not claiming the room, not needing to, because it had already shifted, and in that moment, Daniel understood that what he lost was not his position. It was something far more difficult to regain, the trust and respect of the people who actually made the place run, and no system, no title, and no suit could bring that back once it was gone. By the end of the day, nothing looked dramatically different, yet everything had changed. The garage floor still echoed with the same steady rhythm of work, engines running, tools moving with practiced precision, but the atmosphere carried a quiet clarity that had not been there before. Robert Hayes did not take over with announcements or authority. He did not gather the team or redefine roles. He simply continued working, moving from station to station with the same calm presence, offering guidance when needed, correcting details others overlooked, and in doing so, he reminded everyone what the place had always stood for. Frank worked beside him without hesitation, their movements in sync as if no time had passed, and the younger mechanics watched closely, learning not from instruction alone, but from the way Robert approached each task with focus and respect. Daniel Carter remained in the background longer than he ever had before, his white suit no longer commanding attention but blending into the edges of the room. He observed in silence, noticing things he had ignored, the way a mechanic listened carefully before acting, the way small adjustments prevented larger problems, the way respect flowed naturally when it was earned instead of demanded. He stepped forward once, then paused, choosing his words more carefully than he ever had. "If I misjudged," he began, his voice lower, less certain, but Robert did not interrupt. He simply looked at him, steady, giving space for the moment to exist. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the day settling into something he could not undo. "I should have looked closer," he finished, not an excuse, not a defense, just an acknowledgement. Robert gave a slight nod, not approving, not dismissing, just accepting that truth had finally been spoken, and that was enough, because some lessons do not need to be repeated. They need to be understood. The garage continued around them, steady and grounded. And as the sun lowered through the open bay doors, casting long shadows across the concrete, the space felt different, not because ownership had changed, but because awareness had. And in that quiet shift, something lasting had been restored, not through force, not through power, but through the simple recognition that respect is not given to appearances. It is earned through the way you treat the people and the work in front of you. And that day, without raising his voice, without proving anything twice, Robert Hayes reminded everyone exactly what that looked like.